This is a brief introduction to federation. The road to federation. Many people opposed federation for the following reasons. Local identity would be destroyed, and Western Australia feared large colonies would dominate. Colonial rivalry was another problem that had to be overcome, especially between Victoria and New South Wales, with the protection versus free trade debate. People also wanted to keep Britain in control and keep the tradition, as most people saw themselves as British citizens. People also disagreed on the type of federation, whether the power be given to the federal government or the state government, and feared the loss of power for some colonies. Also, there were the people who simply disliked change. However, there were also many people who supported federation. Reason for federation included concerns about immigration, such as the White Australia policy, leadership, such as Sir Henry Parkes's Tenterfield Address, defence, growing imperialist interests for Australia, economic concerns, the 1890s depression, which would be easier to handle as a nation as more populous states helped less populous states, a sense of nationalism, better communications, sameness of colonies, and for trade. This is a timeline of the major events that happened leading into federation. The first census, which had no Aboriginal participants, occurred in 1881. In 1889, Sir Henry Parkes, the Premier of New South Wales at the time, delivers his Tenterfield Address in favour of it. In 1890, a conference was held and attended by all the colonies and New Zealand. In 1898, the first referendum was held. It was passed in Victoria, Tasmania, and South Australia, but defeated in New South Wales. In 1899, the second referendum passes, with Western Australia not taking part. In 1900, the British Parliament passed the Commonwealth of Australia Constitution Act. Western Australia joined Federation later than the other colonies. This was proclaimed on the 17th of September. Finally, in 1901, the Australian colonies federate, and the Commonwealth of Australia comes into being on the 1st of January. The Commonwealth Parliament opens in Melbourne on the 9th of May. Federation. Australia becomes a nation. Federation is the act of forming states or organizations into a single group with centralized control. There were 4 meetings in the 1890s, and 2 referenda that led to federation in Australia. The first failed, but after a few changes to the constitution, the second was accepted. Most colonies supported the creation of the Commonwealth of Australia. Western Australia had small colonies and feared being swamped by larger colonies. This referendum was brought to London to be approved by the British government. The constitution made 3 different areas of responsibility: the legislature or the parliament, the executive or the courts, and the judiciary or the police. Each of these areas is independent of each other. Since 1901, many referendums have been made proposing changes to the constitution. Levels of government. The 3 tiers of government in Australia are the Commonwealth government or federal government, the state or territory government, and local government. In the Commonwealth government, there are 2 houses, also known as a bicameral system: the House of Representatives, which is the lower house, and the Senate, which is the upper house. Both houses must accept proposed legislation. Living and working conditions in Australia around 1900. Australia was very progressive with things such as higher standard of living, improving pay and conditions, having women rights, and the growing sense of Australian identity. Living standards for the upper class included larger homes with gardens, servants, sewerage, and plumbing. As for the working class, they lived in overcrowded rented cottages in the inner city made out of cheap materials and little insulation, and having few facilities and no proper sewerage. In the working class, with no proper sanitation, there was a large spread of disease. Most of the working class was made of men, and women took care of domestic tasks. Innovations for domestic work at the time included washing machines, where soap, water, and clothes were put in a drum and manually shaken. Coolgardie safes, where safes were made of either a metal or wooden frame to refrigerate food, and ice chests, where boxes were filled with ice. Education was available to most children. Poorer kids skipped school and started work. Wealthier children attended private schools. Boys were taught and encouraged in subjects to pursue a profession. Girls were taught how to do domestic activities. In transport, railways connected most of Australia, besides Western Australia. Railway services replaced other forms of transporting goods and people. However, they weren't connected between states. This was opposed in later years by motorcars. In early creation, motorcars were only available to the wealthy. Overall, working conditions in Australia were very good in comparison to the rest of the world. Australians had a guaranteed basic wage, 8-hour days, pensions, and assistance if you were to be unable to work. However, working conditions still needed improvement, with unsanitary conditions, poor ventilation, often being overcrowded, common injuries, and overtime hours. Legislation that shaped the nation. Legislation that shaped Australia included the Immigration Restriction Act of 1901, the Commonwealth Franchise Act of 1902, the Harvester Judgement of 1907, the Invalid and Old Age Pensions Act of 1908, and the Maternity Allowances Act of 1912. The Immigration Act of 1901, which is known as the White Australia Policy, made it so any prospective immigrants to Australia could be given a dictation test in any language. This meant that non-white immigrants were simply given a test in a language they didn't understand, and hence very few non-white immigrants made it in, and those who attempted declined. Not many people argued against racism, and there were still a large Chinese presence from those from the gold rush and their descendants. The Commonwealth Franchise Act of 1902 made voting available to women over 21. It also made voting unavailable to Indigenous people. This was very progressive at the time. However, women were still nowhere near equal. The Harvester Judgement Act of 1907 introduced the principle of minimum wage. The owner of the Sunshine Harvester Company of Australia applied to the Commonwealth Court to sell his machinery without having to pay taxes. To do this, he had to show that he paid his workers a fair pay. From this instance, the idea of setting a minimum wage was developed. The idea of making a minimum wage over a wage on the worker's output was progressive too. The Invalid and Old Age Pensions Act of 1908 was made due to the increase of people aged 65 or over. It came to recognition that these people had no means of supporting themselves. Hence, a pension was made to support these people. The Maternity Allowances Act of 1912 had an aim to reduce the deaths from births by providing access to medical services. They also agreed to pay £5 to the mother at the birth of a child. That £5 was known as the baby bonus, which encouraged mothers to help create a stronger, whiter Australia. This bonus, as a result, was not given to Aboriginal women. There were many consequences for Indigenous people and women due to the legislation being introduced. For example, only states had the power to make laws for Indigenous people, and Indigenous people were considered members of the Australian community. The federal government actually had no power to make laws for Aborigines under Section 51 of the Constitution. Another example is when the Indigenous people could vote. Initially, they were not to be counted in the census and were denied membership of the Australian community, under Section 128 of the Constitution. Australian women were given the right to vote in 1902, but it was not until 1962 that Indigenous Australians were given full voting rights, and 1967 that they were recognised in the census. Finally, I will briefly talk about two people that influenced Australia's move to federation: Henry Parkes and Alfred Deakin. Henry Parkes was born in 1815 and died in 1896. He moved to Australia in 1839 and served 5 years as Premier of New South Wales. Parkes earned himself the title the Father of Federation because of his famous Tenterfield Address in 1889. He was first to propose federation in 1867. However, he did not believe New South Wales had enough power to set up a federation. In 1881, he was appointed chairman of the National Australian Convention held in Sydney, where he drafted federation. Alfred Deakin was one of the first Australian politicians to begin campaigning for federation. He was the second Prime Minister after Sir Edmund Barton, and was a strong supporter of Immigration Restriction Act. He made a speech saying, "The unity of Australia is nothing. if that does not imply a united race, and unity of race is an absolute essential to the unity of Australia. Hope you learned something today, and thank you for watching this video. See ya!